right, here we are again this morning. Stalin's Closed System of Colossus, Part 5. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. Come into my gallery in downtown Phoenix at 1301 Grand. I'm a painter, writer, thinker. This is Part 5 of Stalin's Closed System of Colossus. We're gonna begin readings on delay, interpretation, and the scholar of history. Like and subscribe. The letter kills, but the spirit gives life. All right, let's begin. He who does not work, neither shall eat. Every revolution writes itself twice, the first time as scripture, the second as commentary. Do not seek instruction. Do not seek instruction in the pages of capital. Scholar under duress, on hermeneutics in condition of scarcity, danger, and ideological storm. Every scholar who lives through upheaval becomes an interpreter of absences, of instructions never written, of guidance never given, of scripture that seems maddening, silent about the crisis now erupting at their door. The duress is not only political but textual. They must read what is not there. The scholar under pressure learns that authority is never a fixed text, but a battlefield of glosses, footnotes, accusations of distortions, and strategic readings, masquerading as fidelity. Interpretation becomes a form of survival, a ration distributed among combatants. Under danger, textuality becomes granular. Every clause is a knife or an escape route. Every citation is a fortification. Every omission is a silent act of defiance. In such climates, exegesis becomes indistinguishable from self-preservation. Alexa, volume up. The scholar's crisis is to discern whether one should obey the letter, which is safe, or the spirit, which is fatal, or that dialectical middle path where the spirit is excavated from the letter by force, producing that dangerous hybrid, justification. A hermeneutic forged under duress always bears its scars. It becomes a commentary with burn marks, a scripture noted in the margins by a trembling hand. Later generations mistake these scars for intentional doctrines, never understanding the conditions that produce them. In times of doctrinal warfare, interpretation becomes a duel. Each side brandishes quotations as weapons. Each footnote becomes a strike. And the scholar learns that scholarship is only the refined form of an older, more brutal conflict over truth's custodians. The interpreter under siege discovers that every text contains a concealed future, not because the founders foresaw our age, but because crisis always turns commentary into prophecy. Cultural parasitism, violence, and patronage on imitation, appropriation, ideological light sources, and the violent economies of attention. Every culture that claims to be the light to the nations inevitably becomes a magnet for the pilgrim and the parasite alike. Some come seeking illumination, others come to feed upon the symbolic prestige housed there. Both movements are forms of violence. Cultural parasitism is the dark underside of admiration. The visitor who arrives with reverence soon begins extracting authority, authenticity, and legitimacy from what they observe, returning home as the inheritor, not the student. Violence and patronage are structurally indistinguishable. The benefactor who funds your work demands your scriptural loyalty. The persecutor who threatens your life demands the same. In both cases, you are not nourished but consumed. Cultural parasites do not merely copy, they canonize. They claim descent from the founding text, declare themselves as true hearers, and accuse all others of deviation. Thus does mimicry turn into sovereignty. Whenever an ideology casts itself as the vanguard, it produces shadow economies of prestige, devotion, suspicion, denunciation, and hermeneutic competition. The real violence is not physical but exegetical. Who interprets the founder correctly becomes a matter of life or death. The parasite always believes they are the guardian. They protect the tradition only by draining it. They preserve the scripture only by embalming it. Thanks for the subscription. If you have any questions, I'm going to read this is the 5th part of Stalin's Closed System. What a shitty reader. Let me see, am I stuttering? Do I not pronounce the words right? Am I gay? What am I? Am I a loser? Anyways, the next group of readings are going to be Fractal Islam. The series that came before this was the unborn levels of Scientology. There's no one doing this online. There's no one who has researched these subjects. If you like my reading, I also do paintings. You can check it out at zuccagallery.com. You can just Google Abe Zucca and see what kind of shitty artist I am too, if I'm a shitty reader. So here we go. Post-revolutionary intellectual life on delay, scripturality, the future is method, and the labor of interpretation after the storm. Every revolution, once victorious, discovers that its promised future does not arrive on schedule. The delay becomes the new scripture, and its interpretation the new philosophical labor. Post-revolutionary life is defined by a peculiar temporality. The present becomes provisional, the future becomes authoritative, and the past becomes dangerous. One must read forward, not backward. In this interim, intellectual life becomes proleptic. The future reads the present, not the other way around. One act is the name of what is not yet, but must someday be. Interpretation becomes anticipatory, teleological, eschatologically tinged. The distinction between letter and spirit becomes the governing metaphysics of the new order. The founding texts become both indispensable and obsolete. Fidelity lies in surpassing them while seeming to preserve them. It's a paradox. The founding figures are constantly resurrected as authorities whose writings must be reinterpreted to justify current necessity. The revolution breeds an endless chain of posthumous co-authors. In the aftermath of upheaval, the intellectual work becomes agriculture. One tills the conceptual soil, uproots the remnants of the old, plants seeds in barren terrain, and waits for fruits that will not appear within one's own lifetime. The post-revolutionary thinker inevitably becomes the theologian of delay, translating the postponed horizon into doctrine, patience, discipline, and the slow work of constructing a world that will never fully escape its own eschatology. The general will and its shadow, axioms of democratic absolutism, revolutionary statecraft, and the fate of the particular. Virtue is nothing but the surrender of the self to the whole. There is often a great difference between the will of all and the general will. Every revolution kills the private in order to save the universal. The dictatorship of the proletariat is only the form of the democratic republic. The general will is total form on the dream of unified citizenry and the disappearance of the particular. All revolutionary reason begins with suspicion that the private self is an obstacle to the public good. The Jacobin dream is therefore not a society of right, but a society purged of particulars, where citizens become an aesthetic practice of subtraction. The general will is the first metaphysical machine of political modernity, a device that transforms the scattered wills of individuals into a single purified intentionality. Its purpose is not representation, but transubstantiation. In Rousseau's schema, rights are paradoxes. One possesses them fully only when one relinquishes them. Liberty is secured when it is alienated. Equality is achieved by surrender. The citizen becomes sovereign by dissolving his sovereignty into the whole. The homogeneous body politic and the political analog to a purified scripture, one voice, one intention, one authoritative interpretation. Particularity is heresy, ambiguity is schism, dissent is sin. The terror of the revolutionary state is not an aberration, but an ideological derivative of its metaphysics. For if private interest is the primordial evil, then the elimination of the private becomes the supreme civic virtue. The general will, lacking a material body, requires interpreters. And those who interpret it inevitably claim the right to embody it. Thus, the purest democracy slides effortlessly into the most doctrinal form of authority. The distinction between the will of all and the general will is the hinge upon which modern totalitarianism turns. It grants the enlightened minority the right to override the unanimous majority when the later errs in its universality. Revolutionary community. On patriotism, equality, and the sacrificial bond. Jacobin equality is not the liberal sameness of legal rights, but the stark equivalence of sacrifice. One proves one's loyalty not by speech or vote, but by the willingness to emulate the private in the name of the collective. Patriotism becomes a sanctified form of self-love and egoism that masks itself as devotion to the whole. One loves the fatherland not because one transcends the self, but because the fatherland becomes the enlarged figure of the self. Every revolutionary community must invent its own culture, but because invention requires selective forgetting, the new nation is constructed not on continuity but on rupture, a future-oriented identity masquerading as ancestral essence. For Rousseau, every democrat nation is universal in principle and particular in fact. The paradox is instructive. Every egalitarian republic must eventually become culturally distinct and thus inward-looking to secure its cohesion. The homogeneity of political identity demands the homogenization of language. The Jacobin assault on the patois was not an aesthetic preference, but a metaphysical imperative. The general will can speak only in one tongue. Every revolutionary nationalism begins politically and ends culturally. The state, born as a juridical abstraction, demands a soul, and it fashions one out of the ruins of the old world. Democracies double on how democracy produces its own dictatorial form. Democracy does not fear tyranny, it fears fragmentation. The dictator enters not as the enemy of the people, but as the purifier of their will, the embodiment of what they ought to have willed if they had been more virtuous. Robespierre's despotism of liberty reveals a structural truth. A project that seeks total virtue inevitably demands total control, for vice is simply the name of all deviation from the unitary will. Let me know if you have any questions. Please like and subscribe. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. I'm a writer and painter in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Let's continue. The revolutionary leader becomes necessary because the people, having been shaped by the corruptions of the old order, cannot yet recognize their own universality. He becomes the pedagogue of their future selves. The suppression of factions is not the deviation from democracy, but its radicalization. To forbid association is to prevent the crystallization of private wills. To destroy civil society is to preserve the purity of the sovereign people. For all its absolutism, the Jacobin dictatorship did not abolish participation, it demanded it. The people were not excluded, but conscripted, mobilized en masse as the living body of the nation's virtue. Terror arrives not as cruelty, but as pedagogy. Its purpose is to teach the people how to will universally and to eradicate those who cannot or will not undergo that pedagogical transformation. Marxist translation on how Marx inherits, reverses, and re-weaponizes the Jacobin tradition. Marx inherits Rousseau not despite his materialism, but because of it. The general will becomes the universal class. The proletariat, particularly, becomes private property. The dissolution of the self becomes the dissolution of commodities. Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat is not a negation of democracy, but its hyperbolic form. The undivided rule of the legislative will is sovereign over the executive, smashing all institutional remnants of the old world. Where Rousseau feared factions, Marx feared bureaucracy, an enemy less glamorous but more persistent. The general will of the people becomes the hammer that must break the parasitic executive machine. Marxism's radicalized Jacobinism by extending its logic into economic life. If the political universal is endangered by private wills, then the economic universal is endangered by private property. Every dictatorship of the proletariat is born under a sign of emergency. Not because the proletariat is tyrannical, but because the old order resists violently, requiring a commensurate response. Marxist revolution is democratic in authorship and dictatorial in method. Its legitimacy flows from universal suffrage. Its survival requires force. The proletariat, through a minority, in most contexts Marx analyzed, could nevertheless rule universally, provided it could win the peasants' material allegiance. Universality is always coalition. The Leninist re-inheritance, on how Lenin recombines Marx and Jacobinism into a single statecraft. Lenin's originality lies not in repudiating Marx, but in selecting from Marxism those elements most compatible with Jacobin centralism and then operationalizing them in a bureaucratically inherited empire. Let me know if you have any questions. Like, subscribe, Google my name, Abe Zucca. This is the 5th part. I'm only going to go 8 parts. I'm hardly even a quarter of the way through this book, but we're going to keep going. Party dictatorship is not betrayal of democracy, but a reinterpretation of it. The conscious minority must rule until the people are transformed into their latent universal selves. In Lenin's revision, the Soviets become Rousseauian assemblies of the people. While the party becomes the interpreter of the general will, a hierarchy justified in the name of unanimity. Smashing the state and capturing the state become interchangeable strategies. Unified by a single goal, the subordination of the executive to the legislative will embodied in the revolutionary vanguard. The Bolshevik state does not yet reject Jacobinism, it consummates it. Terror is no longer episodic but structural, no longer moral but administrative. Where Marx hated bureaucracy at the last refuge of the old world, Lenin accepted it as the unavoidable medium of planning. Thus, centralism mutates from a revolutionary instrument into a permanent regime form. Revolutionary afterlife, on how Jacobinism survives in socialism, nationalism, and modern political theology. Jacobinism survives whenever a people is conceived not as a plurality, but as a single subject, a collective with one ego, one purpose, one destiny. The dream of the purified will returns in every ideology that seeks unity before freedom, virtue before rights, unanimity before dissent. Every modern vanguard movement, from Blanquists to the Bolsheviks, inherits the same core belief that the people cannot be sovereign until they are remade. The revolutionary state always imagines itself as temporary, but nothing is more permanent than provisional authority. Emergency is the most durable of political forms. Jacobinism is not a moment in French history, but a structural temptation of democratic modernity. The desire to perfect equality by annihilating difference. Where the general will is invoked, a pedagogy of virtue follows. Where virtue is demanded, coercion follows. Where coercion persists, terror follows, and beneath terror always lies the longing for an unbroken community. Let's end on that again. Where the general will is invoked, a pedagogy of virtue follows. Where virtue is demanded, coercion follows. Where coercion persists, terror follows. And beneath terror always lies the longing for an unbroken community.